Navigating complex systems, especially when they involve powerful institutions like law enforcement and the courts, it can often feel like you're missing key pieces of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into a stack of material shared by a listener. They were curious about these very interactions, things like recording officers, the challenges that pop up, and, well, a pretty critical look at parts of the justice system itself.
That's right. And what we have here is it's a real mix. There are personal stories, specific observations from incidents, and also commentary on legal concepts, police procedures.
Okay.
Our mission really is to get beyond just listing facts. We
Mhm.
want to pull out the essential insights and maybe some surprising details from these sources just to give you a clearer picture and quickly.
Right. So we'll look at some specific situations mentioned, unpack some common difficulties people apparently faced, according to these accounts, and explore a really critical perspective on the system, like the role of juries. Okay, let's get into it.
All right. So digging into the sources, one of the first things that really comes up is just the act of recording police officers out in public.
Right.
The material basically suggests that, look, simply being on the sidewalk filming, that in itself isn't doing anything wrong. You're just documenting.
But the sources immediately show that while the act might not be wrong, it's certainly not always straightforward or, free of consequences,
Hmm.
at least not according to these accounts.
Mm-hmm.
The sources talk about early problems, like times in Hawthorne where police apparently made arrests just because people were trying to record them, or even just trying to file a complaint.
Wow.
And there's this anecdote here that says when an attorney finally got involved and formally requested evidence back from the city of Hawthorne in one specific case, well, things suddenly shaped up.
Mm-hmm.
The property was returned right away.
Interesting. So that suggests, at least in the source's view, that legal pressure really mattered there.
Yeah, it seems to.
And, the police seem quite aware they're being recorded. The source notes they watch these videos.
Okay.
What's interesting, though, is a contrast the source draws. They mention that by, say, 2017, the California Highway Patrol, the CHP, seemed to have, well, very few issues with photographers.
Mhm.
Actually, the sources, they were for sure unnoticed by CHP, so that might suggest some kind of shift or maybe just a difference between agencies compared to those earlier incidents mentioned.
That is a fascinating contrast. Now, the sources really zoom in on one specific incident that sort of highlights these challenges. It involves an LASD deputy named Walker.
Okay.
The account describes what the source flat out calls an unlawful arrest of a photographer. Their camera gets seized, and the deputy, Walker, reportedly just refuses to explain why.
Refuses? How so?
Well, when asked what the charge was, the deputy is said to have just pointed to the paperwork, which only identified it as 148. And when pressed for more, the claim is he said they didn't have the resources, or maybe that he wouldn't explain because the person wasn't talking to him. Just very unclear.
And that specific incident, it seems to tie into a recurring theme in this material, doesn't it? This difficulty getting cameras, getting video footage back.
Yeah, particularly from LASD, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. The source notes repeated problems there.
Right. And what's really striking, based on this account, is the claim that formal charges they were actually filed after the person apparently confronted Deputy Walker on the street about that initial arrest months later.
Months later. Wow.
Yeah. The source suggests that confrontation actually made things worse, leading to charges appearing maybe a week or so after that street encounter when none had existed before.
Okay, so it escalated.
It seems so, according to the source. And they make a specific point about policy here, too. The source claims police policy says you're not supposed to seize a camera or video unless it's like a homicide investigation.
Right.
And they firmly believe that policy was just not followed in this instance.
So following this material, it's not just challenges with recording itself or getting your stuff back,
Yeah.
but there's also this really critical view on the charges often used.
Like the PC-148.
Exactly. PC-148 or PC-69, which, okay, the penal code defines them around resisting, delaying, obstructing an officer. But the source frames them very differently.
How so?
They basically say these charges are for irritating an officer or just because an officer doesn't like you. And the source explicitly states, flat out, these are not a crime. That's their perspective.
Okay, wow. That's a strong statement. And that kind of critique, it extends beyond just street interactions, doesn't it? The source material shifts quite significantly to the justice system itself, particularly the role of the jury.
Yeah, there's a really pointed critique there. What's the main challenge they raise?
Well, one key thing the source questions is that whole idea of a trial by a jury of our peers.
How do they argue against that? It's such a fundamental concept.
Their argument hinges on how jurors are selected. They point out jurors typically come from voter registration lists.
Okay, standard practice.
Right, but then they argue that people who've actually been convicted sent to prison, while they often lose their right to vote.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Exactly. So the source argues the people on the jury aren't really of equal status to someone who might be on trial, especially if that person has a history with the system. It undermines, in their view, the idea of being judged by genuine peers from all parts of society.
That's a really distinct perspective on peers. And the source also mentions the questions asked during jury selection, right?
Yes, voir
Yeah.
dire. They note jurors get asked things like, have you had negative experiences with law enforcement? Or, do you know anyone who has?
Standard questions, trying to gauge bias.
True, but the source sees it differently. They view it as a way people can basically excuse themselves, get off the jury.
Interesting.
And their advice in the material is pretty blunt. Don't use that as an excuse. Stick around, pay attention. They argue that having experience with the police actually makes you a more informed juror, not less.
So stay on the jury because of your experiences, not despite them.
That's the argument presented. And this feeds into the source's really quite stark view of how juries actually behave.
What they claim happens.
They believe juries often thought of as, the last line of defense against what the source terms an overzealous, aggressive government. They convict, convict, convict.
Just rubber stamping conviction.
That's the feeling conveyed. The source claims this happens even when, maybe to the judge or the lawyers involved, the situation seems really obvious, maybe points away from guilt.
And why do they think jurors do that?
A big part of it, according to the source, is that jurors just fundamentally believe the police are telling the truth. Always.
And they bring up forensics and confessions to back this up.
They do. The source claims DNA evidence, while obviously powerful, has turned out to be most useful for freeing innocent people. Why? Because, in the source's direct words, the cops lie to get convictions.
Wow. Okay, that's a very strong accusation. And confessions.
Similar critique. The source says you essentially can't trust a confession anymore. They suggest confessions might come about through, intense pressure, maybe even torture, or perhaps someone is in a state of delirium. False confessions, basically.
So not reliable indicators of guilt, in their view.
Not necessarily, no. And the source's wrap-up on this whole jury justice system part is, it's pretty unsettling.
What's the bottom line?
They state, quite bluntly, that innocent people get sent to prison every single day, and it's by juries who, according to the source, just can't relate to the defendants and are completely unaware of the lies the source claims are being told within the system.
Okay, that's a very bleak assessment of the jury system. Now, circling back a bit to police conduct, day-to-day interactions, the source material has some pretty pointed observations there, too.
Right, like the comments on salaries.
Yeah, exactly. There's this mention of police salaries, throwing out figures like $250,000 a year. And the source kind of juxtaposes this, saying, you, the citizen, are paying for what they call their billion-dollar lifestyle, while at the same time, you risk getting thrown in a cage for something like a PC 148 or 69 charges. The source argues aren't even real crimes. It sets up a real us versus them framing.
And there's also that perspective on who the police seem to target, isn't there?
Yes. The source feels strongly that police are, quote, defending the bad guys and targeting the good guys.
And good guys in this context seems to mean
people like photographers, auditors, citizen journalists, those documenting public interactions. That seems to be the implication.
Okay.
The material also gets really specific about officer identification.
Yeah.
Or, sometimes the difficulty with it.
Right. They use that anecdote about the pedestrian.
Yeah, the one hit by a green pickup truck.
Yeah.
The source describes the scene, the victim's broken leg, even their concave cab, using all this detail to illustrate a point about IDing officers.
What's the point they're making?
That the visibility of name tags and badges varies wildly. Some vests, like maybe gang enforcement, have big, easy-to-read names.
Okay.
But then a motor officer's badge might have tiny letters. And sometimes, apparently, an officer asked for their name might just point to their sheriff, non-verbally.
Not exactly helpful.
Not always, no. And interestingly, relating back to Deputy Walker, the source notes they knew his name during that incident, even though it was dark, and they admit they couldn't actually read his tag.
So implying maybe prior encounters. Or recognition from video.
It seems to imply existing familiarity, yeah, which kind of feeds into this broader view in the source about accountability, or the lack thereof, and how things can escalate.
How do they describe that escalation?
They describe this pattern where if an officer, one of their own, allegedly breaks the law or messes up policy-wise, the response is to continue to make things worse.
Make things worse how?
Well, they use the camera seizure in that Walker incident as the prime example. The camera is taken, and then later charges are filed against the person who was allegedly attacked and recorded it.
Right, the escalation we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The source calls this malicious prosecution, claiming it dragged on for 2 or 3 years. Basically, pursuing charges without real cause, maybe as retaliation, just compounding the initial problem.
So the source sees it as a way to punish the person for documenting the initial incident.
That's certainly the perspective presented. And then there's this final kind of unsettling point the source makes,
What's that?
that sometimes when dealing with officers, you can't tell the difference from one from the next.
Implying what? A lack of individuality. Or that conduct is depressingly similar.
It's a bit ambiguous, but it suggests a difficulty in distinguishing, perhaps in terms of behavior or accountability, from one officer to another based on these interactions. Wow. Okay, we have definitely covered a lot of ground here, drawing from these sources. We went from the idea of recording police, the practical hurdles described, right through to that really deep critique of the jury system.
Yeah, and the source's views on convictions.
And then back again to specific observations about police conduct, ID issues, accountability problems. We've really unpacked some intense perspectives from this material.
We have, and understanding these dynamics, as they're presented through the lens of this specific source material, it does offer a very distinct perspective.
Right.
It shows how parts of the system can operate, at least according to these accounts, and where those friction points seem to occur. It really highlights the complexities, the challenges people might face, when they're interacting with law enforcement, with the legal system, from this particular viewpoint anyway.
So when you boil it down, what does this all really mean based on what we've just unpacked?
Well, based purely on the source material we've explored today, it powerfully highlights what the source sees as a major tension. A tension between, say, stated rights like the right to record and the actual lived experiences people report having on the street.
Right.
And it underscores the challenges of trying to navigate systems that certainly from this perspective can sometimes feel heavily stacked against you depending on who you are and what situation you're in.
That makes sense. So let's leave our listeners with something to think about, drawing from this material. Considering the source's view on jury selection, the voter rolls versus who ends up incarcerated and their really strong claims about juries just convicting, if you were called for jury duty, how might these perspectives make you think differently about your own responsibility as that potential last line of defense?
That's a great question. It really pushes you to reflect, doesn't it, on how different information, different perspectives like these can shape your understanding. And maybe it highlights the crucial importance of paying close attention, of striving for impartiality. If you ever find yourself in that position of judgment within these really complex systems,